Celebration on the streets of Harare as Zimbabwe's longtime president, Robert Mugabe, resigns. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Robert Mugabe, the man who led Zimbabwe for the last 37 years, has stepped down as the country's president. Mugabe had refused to give up his office after military intervention last week led to his house arrest, and after days of protest, impeachment proceedings were underway in Parliament. But as news broke of his surprise resignation, there were scenes of jubilation across the capital, Harare. Now, as the world's oldest leader gives up power, what's next for Zimbabwe? We begin with this report from correspondent Farai Mwakutuya.
The day began with yet another protest. This was outside the country's parliament, where MPs were initiating impeachment proceedings against Robert Mugabe. The 93-year-old, ruler of Zimbabwe for 37 years, had refused to give in to demands for his resignation. Mounting pressure, the loss of his party's support, and the prospect of impeachment eventually proved too much to bear. The announcement sparked wild scenes of celebration.
I was born in 1980. Mugabe was in power. Up to today, for 3 generations, Mugabe has been in power. Everyone has been suffering because of Mugabe, and nothing was being done. And today marks the new independence.
On behalf of Zimbabwe, I am so happy. We are liberated. I'm so happy for our children. For our generation, I believe this is the new generation, this is the new beginning.
The joy that you are seeing is because the young are looking forward to getting jobs. The young are looking forward to a better future. The young are looking forward to a glorious Zimbabwe. I think this is a new beginning that every Zimbabwean has got a role to play.
Former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa has been nominated by the ruling ZANU-PF party to replace Mugabe. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Okay, let's get to our panel. With me here in the studio is Emira Woods. She's an independent analyst and consultant, and she is Associate Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Also joining us from London is Joseph Ochieno. He is a writer and commentator on African affairs. And with us in the studio as well is Nii Akuetteh. He is an expert on Africa and is the executive director of the African Immigrant Caucus. Welcome to all of you to the show.
Thank you.
But before we get to you, joining us by telephone from Harare is Bright Matonga. He is the former Deputy Minister of Information and former Member of Parliament in Zimbabwe. Bright Matonga, thanks for joining us. We see these scenes of jubilation and rejoice on the streets of Harare. How big a surprise was this? Hello, Bright. Can you hear me? No, I think we've lost that line to Bright. Emira, let me go to you. What's your view on these events that have taken place in Harare? It took place so quickly, didn't it?
Quite a momentous day, right? I think you see the jubilation in the streets. You see the surprise. You know, many thought it will go through an impeachment process, and instead we had the resignation today. So I think what you have is a sense among many in Zimbabwe that there's an end of an era, and many are waiting anxiously to see what's to come.
Right. Let me bring in Joseph in London. Joseph, we look at Robert Mugabe. Here's a man who's a very canny politician. He knows his way around politics. He even took on the might of the British Empire and became president of Zimbabwe. Yet it was all undone by a miscalculation, the fact that he fired his vice president, paving the way for his wife to become the leader of the country. So how big a miscalculation was this?
It's ironical, isn't it, that, yes, as you rightly say, this guy beat up the British Empire. This guy beat up the idea of regime change, which was coordinated by the British and all the white Commonwealth put together. He beat it up. He beat up the opposition, and somehow, at the end of his life, he gets knocked down thanks to the miscalculation, but probably pressure from his wife. And then, as I said, 37 years is a very, very long time. He's a very old man. He had started probably thinking less and less, much more seriously and much more coherently. And it's not surprising that after the big battles you refer to, all the way from the 60s up to the 80s, and particularly very, very vicious political battles, starting in mid-90s, it was very clear that in the last 10 to 5 years or so, he was basically generally a very exhausted man. So the slightest of an emotional thing would actually spark it off. And it would appear that when some of his colleagues went to him to tell him off about whatever his wife was doing, or perhaps that it was going rather too far, he snapped, and the snapping actually led to exactly where we are today.
Okay, I think we've re-established contact with Bright Matonga, who is in Harare. And Bright Matonga, we're talking here with the panel about these dramatic events taking place in Harare. And it seems that there was almost universal support for this change, for this resignation that we have seen. What is the feeling in Harare right now? What are expectations?
Right now, the mood, I think people are all over the place. They left their homes, they're running in the streets, they're just celebrating. This is a day people never expected to come this way. As one of the organizers of the push, it was a bit scary at first, but I just, you took a risk, and you said, hey, whatever happens, let me go for it. But now, look, we're looking to the future now. So we say thank you to President Mugabe. He did quite a lot for the country. But I think when he got the wife, just came maybe the wrong time to wipe out, the great reputation of the African president that he had. And I don't know how they're going to survive, but I suppose that's another story for the other day. But for now, we're looking forward to uniting the people of Zimbabwe, because this final push was not for a fight. It was initiated by war veterans, because the war veterans are apolitical. We just invited everyone to come in and join it, and the response was amazing. It was like an Arab Spring. People walked from wherever they were. It was all towns and cities, villages. Then outside Zimbabweans in the diaspora, they followed suit. It was just amazing, believe you me.
Bright Matonga, you talk about the future. What's next for Zimbabwe? Emmerson Mnangagwa, the vice president, is going to be taking over as leader of the country until the elections next September. Emmerson Mnangagwa himself has a very controversial history. Can we expect much change in the country?
Emmerson Mnangagwa is very smart. But Zimbabweans, they just wanted something that is not Mugabe. So we're saying, hey, he's never been a president, and let's give him a chance. But, he has done exceptionally well from the ministries that he managed, your security, defense, he managed finance, he managed justice, he was a Speaker of Parliament. He's been everything, and we're looking forward. I think Zimbabweans are very positive. They want him, to get a chance. But what we're saying is, Zimbabweans, we need to have some form of transitional government, where you include all political parties, so that they feel this is their country, they have a stake in this country. And, we take it from there. Once we are united as a country, it's easy to lure foreign direct investment, which will be very good for Zimbabwe. Infrastructure is there, it's excellent. All that is required is to put new machinery. Zimbabwe has got the highest literacy rate in Africa.
Right.
This is according to the United Nations. So really, the future of Zimbabwe is very bright.
Bright Matonga, thanks for joining us. That was Bright Matonga, who is the former Deputy Information Minister in Zimbabwe and a member of the Zimbabwe Parliament. Let's get back to our panel. Nii Akuetteh, if we look at the military leaders who precipitated this change, Mugabe's fall, they've been very careful to make sure that this is a civilian change. The military has not actually seized power. How important was that?
I think it's important, but, would I call it careful? I think what they had on their minds were two things, the regional setting and the continental setting. I think one of the best things that the African Union had done was to have set down a rule that if you come to power by unconstitutional means, you are kicked out. And they've been pretty brave about it. I think they need to be given kudos for that. They even kicked out Sisi in Egypt when the United States did not want to say that was a coup. And therefore, I believe that the Zimbabwean military, what they were doing was a coup in all but name, but they were scared to go and declare it a coup. Now, all the changes that have happened in Zimbabwe, and you have to give credit to the Zimbabwean people, you have to share their pain and their relief at the new era because they have suffered. But the way the change came, the military was at the center of it, but they were afraid to say this was a coup because they would have caught a lot of heat from the African continent and from SADC. And by the way, SADC has appointed President Zuma and President Lourenço of Angola. They were scheduled to go into Harare on Wednesday. I hope they still go so that they can look at the situation and make sure that in the relief, in the jubilation of getting a new era, that mistakes are not made, that corners are not caught, that nothing is done in an unconstitutional way.
Emira, if we look at what happened in Harare, this was something that was done by the ruling party, by ZANU-PF. It had the support of the opposition, the Movement for Democratic Change. Will that opposition now be looking for some kind of payback, saying, you know what, we want to be part of this change?
Well, I think clearly the opposition wants to be part of the governance process, right? I mean, you have people who have been clamoring to have a different political environment in Zimbabwe for decades, but especially since the election in 2008, which the opposition, quite frankly, won, right? So I think there's a sense that now the military has used this coup to bring about a change, and I think we have to call it a coup, that's clear, right? To bring about a change. The change seems to be welcomed change, and the new era is being embraced. But that new era has to support all of the principles of democratic governance, of participation of the people. You have, as we already heard, high education rate in Zimbabwe, right. Also strong organizing, right? From faith-based leaders to civil society, trade unionists, well organized, that all are clamoring for a new day. And so I think those voices of democratic change will want to have a say in what's to come. And I think, between now and 2018, when this Mugabe's term ends officially, the ZANU-PF's term ends, there will be a sense of let's wait and see, and give this kind of honeymoon period. But I think what comes next will be critical. Can there be an inclusive environment where all Zimbabweans, regardless of where they come from in the country, regardless of what their ethnicity, what their age, and all of that, that all Zimbabweans have a stake and a role to play in determining their future. I think that's what people are clamoring for now. Yeah, just one point though, no matter what we call it, this change, does it set a bad precedent? Absolutely, right? I think there's a reason why the African Union and SADC, the Southern African Development Community, refuse to see governments that come to power undemocratically and unconstitutionally. So having a military come to power because of the machinery of repression, right? And human rights violations and all the rest that is associated with these militaries, quite undemocratic. I think it does, quite frankly, set a bad precedent. So I think we have to say here a new era has come about, but we've got to make sure that the principles of democratic governance, of popular participation, of creating an economy that works for all, that those principles are upheld by this new government in a new era. Okay, I want to go back to Joseph in London before we take a break. Joseph, here we had a man, Robert Mugabe, who was a war hero, a man who fought for the liberation of his country. Can you pinpoint the time when it all went wrong? I mean, we look at one of the figures, we see that Zimbabweans are now, on average, 15% poorer than they were in 1980, which was the year of independence. Where did it all go wrong for this leader?
I think it probably went wrong in 3 different phases, depending on who. I think for the British and the West, it went wrong from about 1997, exactly about 20 years, about now, November, when Mugabe insisted on having the British honor their commitment to land reforms in Zimbabwe, and then the Blair government refused. And then in an exchange between Claire Short, then Secretary of State for International Development, and the Zimbabwean Agricultural Minister, a letter exchange, it basically tore apart the relationship, and that's where it started. And of course, the Zimbabweans, quite rightly, and supported them very much at the time, simply said, no, if you're really not willing to heed to the agreement that we had in 1980, and of course, we gave a 10-year period of grace, we are going to do it our way. So that was one. So in other words, basically, that was the beginning of creating a Zimbabwe which became the Cuba of Africa. So by the way, Zimbabwe's blockade, economic blockade, was a result of exactly that. And unfortunately, I don't really see many commentators, including many Zimbabweans themselves objectively, talking about this. But anyway, I'm talking from it as an observer. Number two, you could argue, come about the year 2000, when, with the support of the West, the Zimbabwean opposition, by and large, went on to a campaign of constitutional reforms, plus, and then, of course, between the year 2000 and particularly 2008 elections, where it's actually believed that the opposition won. So that was then phase two. Then phase three really is the internal ZANU-PF. 10 years or so ago, there was discussions about possibilities of wanting to have an internal change inside ZANU-PF. And many leaders were either compromised or probably, the succession process was a conflict that people were basically pointing fingers. And that included the then former Vice President, Joyce Mujuru. Bring it forward, really, it was then more about the last 5 years when Grace Mugabe came onto the scene to present herself as an alternative. You could argue then the crash was really about the last 2-3 years, and certainly in the last 1 or 2 months.